On the shores of Alexandria? Or across the Mediterranean? Perhaps a marketplace in the streets of Pompeii? You might see a vessel like this, from its Roman-inspired column to its copper-inlaid mosaic. I think this piece has Tuscany written all over it. If you want to know how I made it, stick around. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Phil. Welcome to my shop. This video is going to be in 3 parts. The first one here, I'll explain the design, the milling of the lumber, and glue-ups. Part 2, we'll focus on the construction, the turning of the vessel, and my mosaic work. And in the third video, we'll cover my sanding and my lacquer finishing technique. The links to the other 2 videos are listed in the show notes below. So without further ado, let's get going.
So this lathe project involves segmented work as well as inlay mosaic art. The inlay is very complex. Each individual piece is wrapped in a thin layer of copper, fitted together, and then set in black resin. And I'll be going into detail on all of that later in the video. Like all of my art, it all starts with an idea. In this case, I was thinking of some sort of a Roman vase. I made a quick sketch of what I was thinking, and then brought the sketch to my computer. I use a segmenting software called Woodturner Pro. It was designed by a fellow woodturner, Lloyd Johnson. This is a fantastic little program that saves me a ton of time. I've got a link to Lloyd's website listed in the show notes below. I won't go into too much detail about this program in this video. However, leave me a comment below if you would be interested. So at a high-level view of how this program works, you simply start adding rows indicating the thickness of the stock you're using and how wide each ring will be. Now I know I wanted my vase to be about 20 inches tall and 14 inches wide. So in this example, it took me 30 rings to reach my goal of 20 inches. And again, if you think you'd like to see how I construct a project in this software in detail, leave me a comment below. You know, when you construct a segmented piece, it's extremely important that you've overlapped each segmented ring just enough so when you do turn it, you're not going to be turning into air. You need some meat left on the bone, if you get my drift. Now this particular view right here will show you how thick or thin your piece would be once you turn down to final thickness. In this view, you can see each individual ring. And my favorite screen in the software is the cutting summary. This program automatically calculates the data you entered and then produces a very accurate cut list. And I mean it's very accurate. And this is a huge time saver for me in the shop when it comes to selecting my stock and then milling it to the thickness I need for the project. And this view is pretty cool. You toggle the switch and it rotates your design so you can get a better 3-dimensional view of the final piece. Such a great software. Okay, back in the shop. As the title states, I am the Exotic Woodworker. Almost all of my pieces include at least one exotic wood species. In this project, I've decided to use African Padauk, zebra wood, and purple heart accents. Now this is where that cut list comes in very handy. The cut list tells me how much of each stock I need to complete each ring, as well as how wide the piece must be and also its thickness. I square all the edges up on the joiner. I take the large boards over to the table saw and trim them to width. I trim the smaller pieces over on the bandsaw. And then over to the planer for final thickness. As I complete the stock for each ring, I bring it back to the bench and I draw a squiggly line on one side and a straight line on the perpendicular side. And I'll explain more about this once we start cutting out segments. In here I mill up my zebra wood. Notice how I'm pressing that stock to the back fence. It's imperative that these pieces be very square. This is a common fail amongst a lot of woodworkers. For that piece to be completely square, you must put the pressure on the back fence. And over to the table saw. So I guess this is a good time to say that you must really be organized when you're doing this procedure. It's very easy to make errors if you're milling lumber and just tossing them in a pile. I like to stack mine per ring, and I place a ring identification number on a piece of blue painter's tape next to the lumber. Then, when I'm ready to cut the angled pieces per ring, I'm not mistakenly cutting the stock for a different intended ring. Don't ask me how I know. I ran out of my long stock, so I'm here fishing through my spindle stock of Paduke, looking for the remaining pieces I need for my rings. Throughout this process, I keep a pair of measuring calipers in my pocket. It's very important to keep checking your progress as you go along. If not, well, then your project might look a little bit different than the original design. And again, don't ask me how I know. At the miter saw, I like to trim off the ends of pieces that have a little checking. Pieces that are about 12 inches, give or take, I don't feel comfortable bringing these over to the table saw. So I do all this milling up at the bandsaw. The only drawback of using a bandsaw is the cuts aren't as smooth as you'd like. So I finish these up over on the planer. Okay, we're about to start cutting segments for the ring, but first I'd like to give my table saw blade a nice sharpening. To get very tight and accurate joints, it's imperative that your blade be very sharp. This little diamond sharpener is probably the best thing I've ever purchased at Harbor Freight. It works great. So here I'm going to cut my ring segments on my Segi sled. This double fence sled was invented by Jerry Bennett. The sled's sole purpose is for cutting angled segments for constructing absolute perfect rings. Jerry sells pre-cut acrylic angles that you simply plop in the middle of the sled, cinch it down, and you'll get perfect rings every time. I've decided to go with a 24 segment ring. And for all you that paid attention in math class, you should know if you divide a circle, which is 360 degrees, by 24, that will give you 15. Therefore, each segmented piece must have two sides that equal 15 degrees. Mr. Bennett is a gifted artist, woodworker, and inventor. He's also very intelligent. His segmentology philosophy is fascinating. You can check him out on his website. You'll find a link to it in the show notes. On his website, he offers free plans to make this sled, if you're interested, as well as the acrylic wedgies. This saw stop is also Jerry's design, as well as this zero clearance insert that allow the segments to safely fall away from the blade. And now here it is in action. I usually make the first cut on the bottom fence. And then the second cut on the top fence. And you'll notice before I make the cut, I slide the piece over so it touches the saw stop. I have a ruler attached to the top of my saw stop, and that's where I set each ring's length. And how do I get the length? Very simple. I go back to the cut sheet. I don't like my fingers to get too close to that blade. So as you can see here, I'm taking advantage of one of those lockdown clamps that I added to my sled. So if you remember, when I cut each piece, I drew a squiggly line on one side and then a straight line perpendicular. This is to make up for any slight irregularities in the cuts of the wood. By flip-flopping every other one, if there were any irregularities, this process will equal them to zero. And as you can see by looking at this ring, the joints are tight. You don't see any light coming through the cracks. Now remember I said it helps to be organized when you're doing this process? Well, what I like to do is I take each cut ring and I place the pieces in a bag. Now these little poly bags are simply newspaper sleeves that you can purchase online. They're very inexpensive. And as you can see, I write the number of the ring on the bag. This makes it easy for me for when the time comes that I do my glue-ups, I know which ring I'm working on. And I simply take that number that's off the bag and I'll write that on one of the pieces. This is important for your sequence of the construction. There's been several times after I've already cut a ring that I realized that the width was incorrect. So rather wasting wood and taking more time to cut out 24 more segments, I've come up with this little sanding jig. The jig is attached to my disc sander and I simply go down through and sand each piece to its correct width. To achieve consistent depths, I attached a depth stop on the push stick, just made out of an Allen key. And I've already found this jig to be very handy in the shop. I use it for other projects as well. This is how I glue up my pieces. I come up with this quick way of just laying the pieces down on the side and squeeze them together with a clamp. This way I can glue them all at the same time rather than individually like I used to. And as you can see here, I'm not only spreading out the glue, but I'm pressing it really good into all those wood fibers. This will result in a nice rock solid joint. I don't flood my joints with glue. That just makes more of a mess later. I don't starve them as well, but I just add just enough so there's little squeeze out and very easy cleanup at the sander afterwards. Now every so often I'll come across a ring that's not perfect. Although that Segi sled is very accurate, not keeping the workpiece tight against that fence will often result in some irregularities, such as this one here. The easiest way to fix this is to make half rings, such as I'm doing here, by placing a dowel in between the piece, right exactly in the middle of the ring. Once the glue's dry, I'll take them out of the clamp, and I'll have 2 half rings. Then I'll take them over to the table saw and square them up, and I'll show you that just in a moment. I like to use hose clamps when I'm gluing up my joints. This helps with a nice tight joint, as it helps squeeze that glue into those wood pores even further. It's important that your glue up is nice and flat, so I'll take a dead blow hammer and smack all the cracks down really well. I find this also helps with stress. Certainly if I've had a bad morning, beating the daylights out of a few rings sure makes the day feel better. Once I clamp it all up, I hang it up to dry. Gluing up little tiny pieces can be very messy. So what I do is I clamp down a straight edge and use that as a back fence. I'll then take another straight edge and press the pieces back to the fence. And then with a little light pressure, with one finger on one side, I'll press the whole group against that stop stick, as you can see there. And then when I apply my glue, it's not going to drip down in between all the pieces and make a big mess. And as you might notice, I like to use a lot of wax paper. I rip off a piece for each ring. It makes the cleanup go much easier. Okay, so here's that half ring that we glued up earlier. And as you can see, the joints are not level. I made this clamping jig to cut rings parallel. Now if the ring wasn't so large, I could have simply walked it over to my disc sander and level it there. Speaking of disc sanders, I made this large version for my lathe. After all of my rings are dry and I take them out of their clamps, I like to sand one side flat. By doing so, once I bring this over to my drum sander, I'll have a nice flat surface for it to sit on. Before I start my sanding process, I do mark all my pieces with some white chalk, as you can see here. This will assure that all the low spots will be covered. I'll continue with the sanding until all the white chalk is gone. Now that one surface is flat, I can bring my pieces over to my drum sander. Now I know some of you guys are probably saying, why not just bring this over to the planer? Well, I have in the past, but I've also had some bad experiences as well. I find that the planer might be a little bit too aggressive. Sometimes the cutting blade will latch onto a glue joint and pull the ring apart. It's a good idea to put the smaller rings inside the larger rings. The guide rollers are only 7 inches, so anything less than that could get caught up in the machine. When I have a lot of rings under 7 inches, I prefer to glue them down on a flat board. Then I can take this board to my drum sander. To attach my rings to this board, I could use double stick tape, but that double stick tape is way too expensive for me. I prefer this method. I learned this technique from a guitar luthier. All you need is painter's tape and CA glue. I buy my tape in 1-inch rolls and 2-inch rolls, and I get them from Amazon. They're just generic brands, very inexpensive.
Oh hey, you're still watching. Well, that must mean you like my video. Well, please hit the like and subscribe button down here somewhere. I would appreciate it. And ring that bell so you won't miss any future videos. I'll wait. Come on! What are you waiting for? Click 'em!
And this process is very simple. Place your tape on the flat board, put another piece on your project, and you just use a little bit of CA glue, hit it with a little accelerator, and then stick it down. Trust me, it ain't moving once you put it down. And the best part about this technique is the cleanup is a snap. And now we just take the board and put it through the drum sander. Yeah, I don't mind a few creepy crawlies in the shop. They keep the bug population down. Incidentally, the board I'm using here is an MDF board with melamine on both sides. I try to make a habit of keeping a few of these around the shop at all times for such projects like this. And as you can see, they pry off very easily. And you peel the tape off and there's no mess afterwards. Okay, once the rings have all been sanded, I like to stack them in the order of which they've been designed. This will give me a first-time real preview of what the piece will look like prior to the glue-up. Okay, now it's time to glue up some rings. I start off with the base. The base is attached to my glue block. I screw that onto the lathe, and I like to lock them down really good. My lathe also has a reverse, and I like to turn in reverse in many situations. But if that chuck's not locked down, it could come off in reverse, so be cautious. So this is the first ring that I'm gluing on, and as you can see, I'm attaching it to my cold jaws. Of course, the cold jaws will ensure that that ring is going to be perfectly centered. And there's many ways to glue up rings off the lathe, but I found gluing them on the lathe is much more accurate. And by the way, the glue that I'm using is original Type Bond. It has a very short open time and it dries very quickly. After applying a little bit of pressure, I like twisting them back and forth. This assures that any excessive glue will be squeezed out. Yeah, and you're reading that correctly. All you need is 10 minutes at the most between rings. That's why I like using the original Type Bond. If I were to use Type Bond 2 or Type Bond 3, I'd have to let it sit in the clamps at least for about 45 minutes. Before I glue on the next ring, I like to give the current ring a good sanding. This will ensure that my rings will continue to be parallel as I build additional layers. Whenever I replace my sandpaper on my drum sander, I always find several pieces that are in fine shape. I'll save those and I'll glue those on blocks such as this. Now I just repeat and continue building the vase. Now once the rings start to get wider, they require more pressure. I don't like to apply too much pressure on my tailstock as it's not healthy for the lathe and it can damage my cold jaws. So I like to add about 4 clamps whenever I can. And here I'm switching over to my Easy Chuck by Easy Wood Tools, as its expansion jaws are much wider. Once I have about 5 or 6 rings built out, I'll go in and I'll start turning the inside. The tool I'm using here is a Jimmy Clue's Mate No. 1. This tool features a cupped round carbide cutter that's set at a 22-degree angle. Unlike a traditional round cutter, this one does not self-feed. It's a very forgiving tool. I was getting some vibrations through my cuts, so I decided this would be a good time to go ahead and set up my homemade steady rest. The light pressure provided by these skateboard wheels completely take away the vibration. It allows for me to get a nice smooth cut.
Where did the time slip away? Okay, I'm going to call it a day at this point. We'll pick back up at the next one. I really hope you found some value in this video. If you learned something today, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to ring that bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. Thanks for joining me today. In the next video, we'll finish the turning of this piece as well as how I constructed the mosaic work. I'm Phil DeCarlo. Until the next one, cheers.